Boxing has the deepest history of all organized sports. The early days were chronicled through writing, and we now witness combat spanning more than a century with our very own eyes. We have long pondered who would win in a matchup between the greats of the past. In today's episode, we take a look at a matchup between the first recognized world heavyweight champion in boxing, the Boston strong boy John L. Sullivan, and former colored heavyweight champion and Canadian, Old Chocolate George Godfrey. John L. Sullivan had a total of 41 official bouts under the Marquess of Queensberry rules, which is what all boxers compete under today. Sullivan had 38 wins, 32 by knockout, with a knockout ratio of 84%. He suffered only one defeat. He had one draw and one no decision. He stood at 5 feet 10 and a half inches with an aggregate weight of 208 pounds over his career. This included a 74-inch reach. Not to be confused with the American of the same namesake, the original George Godfrey had a total of 44 official fights. Godfrey amassed 22 victories with 17 coming by way of knockout for a 77% KO ratio. He suffered 6 losses, 5 by knockout. Godfrey had a total of 13 draws, which was common during this time, and 3 no decisions. He stood at 5 feet 10 and a half inches with an aggregate weight of 173 pounds over his career. Sullivan was the first superstar in the sport of boxing, and is credited with taking boxing mainstream. Sullivan is the last bare-knuckle champion, but he was truly a proponent for gloved fighting, the sport we know now. Sullivan was usually quick out of the gates and was the first to introduce the knockout as a regular occurrence in the sport at a mainstream level. Under the bare-knuckles rules, fights could get drawn out and often featured a lot of holding in wrestling, not to mention eye gouging. Sullivan, for his time, represented the shift to knockouts in a similar capacity to what the Manasseh Mauler Jack Dempsey represented some 30 years after that in the Roaring Twenties. Sullivan often swarmed his opponents with a barrage of shots which usually led to early knockouts or stoppages. He wasn't one for movers and what would now be considered more defensive fighters, and truly thrived off of fighters who chose to come forward and fight fire with fire. Sullivan would fight anywhere as he truly came of age in an era where a barge, basement, or good old-fashioned dirt could prove equally as satisfying as the standard boxing ring. He was most certainly hardened for a sport long riddled in controversy. George Godfrey got a late start in boxing and didn't turn pro until the age of 27. Despite the late start, the boxer-puncher did find great success. Godfrey wasn't a large heavyweight, but he could put his punches together well, and was noted to have dropped several opponents and caused cuts on opponents. Godfrey was also able to use his boxing acumen to find success later in age during a time when fighters were well worn by the time they reached their mid to late 30s and 40s. Sullivan held titles from 1882 to 1892. Some of his more notable opponents are Charlie Mitchell, who he faced on more than one occasion, even under bare-knuckle and London prizefighting rules. James J. Corbett, to whom he lost his world heavyweight title to in 1892, the only man to have defeated Sullivan. Paddy Ryan, his first signature win where he won the American bare-knuckle championship, and another fighter he faced on more than one occasion. Patsy Cardiff, for whom he drew with Jake Kilrain, the fighter for which he officially won the bare-knuckle championship of the world. Dominic McCaffrey, a contender from his time, though some sources credit this fight as being the decider for the World Heavyweight Championship. Sullivan is also alleged to have participated in around 400 to 500 unofficial fights and exhibitions for which he won. For a boxer that started late, Godfrey did not disappoint. Godfrey took on bare-knuckle great Jake Kilrain in only his 5th pro fight, boxing to a draw. He also lost to Kilrain a year later. Other notable opponents include black contender C.C. Smith, a loss to the great Joe Koinski, who famously knocked out Jack Johnson. Godfrey and Koinski were also slated to fight in 1895 per the Topeka Star-Journal. A win over Patsy Cardiff, who drew with John L. Sullivan. A loss in an excellent scrap against Australian heavyweight great, Peter Jackson. A knockout victory of the durable UK fighter, Denver Ed Smith. And a draw and win over McHenry Johnson in 2 fights billed for the Colored Heavyweight Championship. The Colored Heavyweight Championship represented the highest title claim a black heavyweight could achieve during those times. Style and skill are even. Both men were masters of their own style and each found success. For Sullivan, he started at a younger age, but Godfrey was able to use his skill to successfully campaign at a more advanced age by comparison. Endurance goes to John L. Sullivan, who fought in some of the longest bare-knuckle fights in history and trained for competing over the course of long periods. Godfrey did fight in many very long fights, but the majority of his losses came later in fights after he was worn down. Power is even as both fighters could effectively get their opponent out of there when needed. Sullivan amassed more knockout victories throughout his career. That said, Godfrey was able to knock out some very formidable opponents during his career, even at an advanced age by some standards. Speed goes to Sullivan, who often beat his opponents to the punch and was notably a fast starter. Resume goes to Godfrey by a slight margin as he faced all of the top opponents willing to face him, including Peter Jackson, who many wanted to see face off with Sullivan, in addition to calls for Sullivan to face George Godfrey himself. Intangibles go to Sullivan with the edge. He was a very marketable fighter and was known across America and across the pond. There are rumors that Sullivan and Godfrey actually faced off in a bare-knuckle competition that was stopped early after police got wind. This, though, could be speculation. Media and fans at the time were certainly interested in the fight, and it would have likely been one of the greatest battles of the late 1800s. Godfrey would have also been the first black fighter to get a shot at the world heavyweight title, which would have been major for the time, and may have opened the doors for a number of other black heavyweight greats. All things considered, 86 Boxing favors the Boston Strongboy, John L. Sullivan, for the victory over Old Chocolate George Godfrey via late stoppage. Sullivan's ability to weather early storms and fight deep as the rounds went on would prove to be of benefit, as Godfrey lost some of his most high-profile fights in later rounds. Godfrey would be sharp enough to give Sullivan fits and might even bust him up early, but he too would have to take a great deal of damage in order to get his licks in. Both fighters were documented as having fought in fights that lasted well over 2 hours, which is unfathomable this day and age. One thing I believe we can all attest to is that this would have been a very entertaining fight as long as it lasted. We can all just wonder,